The courtroom was filled with an air of intense anticipation, the kind that could choke anyone caught in its web. David Harlow sat at the defense table, hands clasped tightly, a bead of sweat tracing down his forehead. It wasn't the first trial he had fought, but something about this one felt different. The case was tight, almost suffocating. His client, a young man with a shattered past, was accused of a crime he swore he didn't commit. But David's instincts screamed that there was more to this case, something hidden beneath the surface. The judge's gavel rang out, its sound reverberating through the air like a warning. Court is now in session. The voice of the judge cracked the silence, and every eye in the room shifted toward him. Across from David stood the prosecutor, Catherine Harris, a woman known for her precision and ruthlessness in the courtroom. Her sharp, calculating gaze never wavered from David as she prepared to deliver her opening remarks. "Ready for the fight, Harlow?" she asked, her voice dripping with confidence. David didn't respond, but inside, his pulse quickened. He wasn't ready. No one could be. But he had no choice but to step forward. The case was only just beginning, but the stakes had never felt higher. This trial could ruin him, or it could redeem everything he had lost. David sat back in his seat, scanning the witness as she made her way to the stand. The case seemed to be slipping through his fingers, and it didn't help that his client's fate rested on the shaky testimony of this woman. She wasn't the most reliable witness, yet she was all they had. As she took her place, David tried to steady his nerves, knowing that every word she said could change the course of the trial. Her name was Clara Davis, a woman in her late 30s with a reputation for being a bit too involved in the details. She had been at the scene, the night of the crime, or so she claimed. Her testimony could be the key to clearing his client, but something in her eyes told him that she was hiding something. Her gaze flickered between the jury and the defense table, almost as if searching for something or someone. David's instincts began to churn. He leaned forward, scribbling down a few notes. There was something off, something not quite right. Before he could make a move, Clara began speaking, her voice shaking but firm, trying to convince everyone in the room that she had seen everything. David listened carefully, knowing that every word she spoke could either save his client or bury him alive. The tension in the courtroom was suffocating as Clara Davis continued her testimony. Every word felt like a knife in David's chest. But then something unexpected happened. Clara paused. Her voice faltered, her eyes shifting nervously from side to side. David could feel his heart race. His instincts screamed that something was wrong. I can't testify for you anymore," Clara suddenly declared. A heavy silence followed. The words felt like they had been ripped from her soul, and the courtroom held its breath. The eyes of the entire room turned to her, confusion and disbelief written on their faces. David's mind was reeling. This was not part of the plan. He had trusted Clara. He had counted on her testimony to give his client a fighting chance. But now, everything was falling apart. "I've been threatened," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can't do this." David's stomach churned as he struggled to process her words. The room erupted in whispers, and Catherine Harris's lips curled into a sly, almost satisfied grin. David's eyes burned with anger, but he knew he couldn't let that show. Not here. Not now. The betrayal stung deep, but there was no time to dwell on it. He had to find a way out. He had no choice but to keep fighting. He couldn't let this be the end. Not yet. David felt the weight of the room pressing down on him as Clara's betrayal hung in the air. His mind raced, but there was no clear answer. He could feel the eyes of the jury, the judge, the prosecutor, all turning on him. His reputation, his career, all of it teetered on the edge. He stood up slowly, his gaze shifting to the window behind him, where the last rays of sunlight filtered through. The choice before him was unbearable, and yet it was clear. The truth was out of reach. He could play it safe, go with the defense he had planned, the one that had worked for him in the past. But something inside him screamed that this time was different. His client's life was on the line, and David had always prided himself on being a man of integrity. Yet, integrity was costly in this courtroom. He could see the way Catherine Harris was moving, gathering her strength, preparing for the kill. The thought of backing down, of losing everything he had worked for, was suffocating. "I'll expose the truth," David whispered to himself, though he wasn't sure if it was the right decision. There was no going back. Not now. Not ever. As the case dragged on, the cracks in the prosecution's story started to show, but David couldn't afford to be too confident. His earlier instincts had been right. There was something more to this case than anyone realized. As he sifted through the evidence, a realization hit him like a punch to the gut. The person responsible for this crime wasn't the one everyone thought it was. The web of lies, the manipulation, it all pointed in a different direction. The true culprit was someone close to home, someone he'd never suspected. The revelations were overwhelming, but David wasn't ready to share them yet. He needed to dig deeper. But every step he took seemed to lead him further into a dark labyrinth of deceit. He could feel the walls closing in. It wasn't just his client's life at stake anymore. David's own future, his career, everything he had fought for was at risk. And if the truth came to light, it would destroy more than just the case. It would ruin the people involved. David rubbed his temples, the weight of the decision pressing on him. "There's no turning back now," he muttered. As he prepared to expose the truth, he couldn't help but wonder what the cost would be. The weeks following the betrayal had been a whirlwind of confusion, uncertainty, and silent strategy. David's world was crumbling beneath him, but something had changed. The once impassable wall between him and the truth was beginning to crack. As he pored over the case files late one night, a small detail leaped off the page. It was a seemingly insignificant comment from the first witness, Clara Davis, one that David had missed in the chaos of the courtroom. Her account of the night in question was inconsistent with the timeline, something that didn't add up. Could this be the break he was waiting for? David felt a flicker of hope. His mind raced as he quickly compiled a list of questions to ask the next witness, but as he did, another realization hit him. The entire case was built on false assumptions, starting with Clara. The prosecutor, Catherine Harris, had manipulated the evidence and testimony to her advantage, bending it to fit her narrative. David knew that his chances were slim, but with this breakthrough, he might just have a chance to expose the truth. He stood up, his eyes flashing with renewed determination. There was a fight to be had, and he was ready for it. The courtroom was about to witness a new kind of battle, one where David would play by his own rules. The courtroom felt different today. There was a new energy in the air, a palpable shift as David walked in. He had been waiting for this moment, but now that it was here, he was unsure of what would come next. The day had arrived to confront the lies head-on. Clara was called to the stand once again, but this time David was ready. He stood up, his gaze fixed on her as he approached the witness box. "Clara," he began, his voice steady but carrying an edge of authority, "you said you were threatened, but your story doesn't match the evidence. Can you explain why?" Clara's eyes darted around the room, looking anywhere but at him. The unease in her voice was apparent as she stammered, trying to defend her earlier statement. David knew that she wasn't lying, she had been manipulated. But it wasn't enough to stop him. With every question, he pressed deeper, unraveling the inconsistencies in her testimony. The truth was slipping through her fingers, and David was ready to catch it. Catherine Harris remained stone-faced, but David could feel her discomfort. This was the turning point. If he could break Clara, the entire case could fall apart. And David was going to make sure it did. David had always known that the truth could be a double-edged sword, but now he was beginning to understand just how dangerous it could be. As Clara's defense crumbled, David felt a surge of victory, but it was short-lived. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, and with each new revelation, the case became more complicated. As he dug deeper, he uncovered something far more troubling. The prosecutor, Catherine Harris, had a connection to the victim, one that she had gone to great lengths to hide. David's heart sank as he realized what this meant. Catherine was not just a prosecutor, She was part of the very web of deceit that had been spun around this case. This discovery shook David to his core. He couldn't trust anyone anymore. The trial had become personal, and the stakes were higher than ever. Catherine had been playing a much larger game, and David had to figure out how to expose her without ruining everything. There were too many lives at stake, and he couldn't afford to lose his footing now. His only choice was to take the fight to Catherine, but it would be a battle of wits, and he wasn't sure he was prepared for the war that lay ahead. David couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in on him. The discovery about Catherine was just the beginning. As he pieced together the new evidence, he realized that the conspiracy surrounding the case went much deeper. His mind raced as he recalled every interaction, every subtle glance between Catherine and her assistant. There was more going on than he could ever have imagined. The truth was hidden in plain sight, obscured by a veil of lies and manipulation. But David wasn't ready to back down. If Catherine was involved in this, then he had no choice but to expose her. The danger was immense, not just to his career but to everyone around him. As David prepared to confront Catherine, he knew that this would be the most dangerous move he had ever made. He had to act quickly. If he waited too long, the entire case could be compromised, and the truth would remain buried forever. The trial was moving faster than he could keep up with. But David had learned one thing for certain. This was not just a battle for his client's freedom. It was a battle for justice itself, and he wasn't about to lose it. The confrontation with Catherine had been inevitable. David knew that he couldn't keep hiding from the truth, and neither could she. With the evidence he had gathered, he was ready to make his move. Catherine sat at her desk, her face calm, but her eyes betraying the nerves that lingered beneath the surface. David walked into the room without hesitation, his presence commanding attention. "It's over, Catherine," he said, his voice low but steady. "I know everything." Catherine's eyes narrowed, and for the first time David saw a flicker of fear in her otherwise controlled demeanor. "You think you've won," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "You're nothing more than a pawn in a much larger game." But David was done playing by her rules. With the truth in hand, he knew he had the power to expose her lies, but it wouldn't come without consequences. As he left her office, the weight of what he had just done settled on his shoulders. The battle was far from over, but for the first time David felt like he was in control. The final gambit had been played, and now, there was no turning back. David had always known that the truth had a way of coming to the surface, no matter how deep it was buried. But now, as he stood in the middle of the courtroom, watching the prosecution's case unravel, it wasn't just the truth at stake anymore. It was his very career. He had spent weeks searching for answers, piecing together fragments of evidence, and confronting enemies who lurked in the shadows. But now, the moment had arrived. Catherine Harris stood across from him, her face as cold as ever, but David could see the tension in her eyes. The cracks were beginning to show, and she knew it. David had discovered the missing link, the connection between her and the victim, a relationship she had gone to great lengths to hide. His heart raced as he glanced at the jury, their expressions betraying the doubt that had begun to creep into their minds. The case had been carefully constructed, but it was all based on lies. The time had come to expose everything. "Your Honor," David began, his voice strong and steady, "the prosecution has withheld key evidence from this court, and I intend to prove it." Catherine's lips tightened, but she said nothing. The battle was far from over, but David knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to back down now. David had one shot to turn the tide, and he wasn't going to waste it. He called his next witness, a man who had been the key to unlocking the truth behind the victim's death. Daniel Moore was an investigator, a former associate of Catherine's who had seen too much. The moment he stepped into the courtroom, all eyes turned toward him. His presence was commanding, and his face was filled with a quiet resolve. Daniel knew the risks of testifying, but he had decided that justice was more important than loyalty to someone like Catherine. As he took the stand, David's heart raced. "Mr. Moore," David began, his voice cutting through the silence, "can you tell the court what you discovered about the victim's connection to the prosecutor?" Daniel cleared his throat before speaking, his voice steady but filled with the weight of the truth. Catherine Harris was not just a prosecutor in this case, he said, locking eyes with the jury. She was personally involved with the victim. They had a history that has been carefully concealed. The room erupted in shock, and David knew that he had just landed the first blow in what would be a long and difficult fight. The courtroom descended into chaos the moment Daniel finished his statement. The prosecution, led by Catherine Harris, was scrambling to regain control. The judge banged his gavel, calling for order, but the damage had already been done. The jury was whispering among themselves, their doubt now clear. David felt a surge of hope, but knew this was far from over. Catherine stood up, her voice dripping with fury. "This is nothing but an attempt to derail the case," she shouted, her hands trembling with barely contained rage. "Mr. Moore's testimony is invalid, and you should disregard it immediately." David rose to his feet, his voice calm but firm. "Your Honor, the truth has come to light, and it cannot be erased," he said. "The connection between the prosecutor and the victim is undeniable. The court must recognize this as a crucial piece of evidence." Catherine's face was now a mask of pure hatred. David could see that she was losing control, and he wasn't about to let her regain it. This trial was far more than just a case. It was a fight for justice, and David had no intention of backing down. The day had been filled with twists, but the most shocking revelation was still to come. David had prepared himself for many things, but not for the bombshell that was about to drop. As the trial continued, a new witness was called to the stand, someone who could tear the case apart. This witness was not just any person. It was someone close to David, someone who had been part of his life long before this trial had begun. The witness was Emily, his sister, who had been silent up until now. She had seen something that could completely change the direction of the case. "I know what I saw," Emily said, her voice shaking as she stepped into the witness box. "The victim didn't die the way everyone thinks he did. I was there that night, and I saw the truth. Catherine Harris was involved." David's heart skipped a beat. Emily's testimony was a game-changer. She had been a silent observer, but now she was stepping forward with the truth. Catherine's expression faltered for the first time. Emily's words had shattered the illusion of control that Catherine had so carefully built. David's mind raced as the full extent of the conspiracy became clear. With Emily's testimony, David knew the tide had turned in his favor, but there was still one more hurdle to overcome: Catherine herself. She was no longer just the prosecutor, she was the heart of this conspiracy, and David had everything he needed to expose her. The final confrontation was set to take place in the judge's chambers, and David knew that this would be the most dangerous moment of all. As Catherine entered the room, her face was pale, but her eyes were sharp, betraying nothing of the fear she felt. "You think you can defeat me?" Catherine sneered, her voice laced with venom. "You've exposed my secrets, but that won't stop me. I still hold the power here." David didn't flinch. "Not anymore," he said, his voice unwavering. "The truth is out, Catherine. The jury knows who you really are, and you won't walk away from this." The silence in the room was deafening, but David knew that this was the moment that would determine everything. Catherine's power had been shattered. The case, once hers to win, was now in David's hands. He had fought hard for this, and he wasn't about to lose it now. David could feel the energy in the room shift. The jury's eyes no longer held certainty. Instead, there was a glimmer of doubt that hadn't been there before. This was his opening. Every detail from the past weeks had led to this moment, and he couldn't let it slip. Catherine Harris sat rigid at the prosecution table, her jaw clenched, her fingers tapping in a slow, deliberate rhythm. David knew she was calculating her next move. But so was he. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," David said, standing tall, "you've seen the evidence and heard the testimonies. Ask yourselves, why would these truths be buried if justice was truly being served?" His voice echoed through the courtroom, resonating in the heavy silence. He could see the jurors exchanging looks, the cracks in Catherine's case widening. The judge watched closely, his expression unreadable. This was the moment to plant the seeds of reasonable doubt, and David was going to make sure they took root deep in the minds of every juror in that room. David approached the witness stand with measured steps, his eyes locked on the man seated there. This witness was Catherine's last stronghold, the testimony she was counting on to seal her case. David intended to dismantle it piece by piece. "Mr. Klein," David began, his voice calm but edged with purpose, "you stated that you saw my client at the scene, correct?" The man nodded, avoiding direct eye contact. David leaned in slightly. "And yet, the timestamp on the surveillance footage contradicts your statement by almost 30 minutes. How do you explain that?" A bead of sweat trickled down Klein's temple. The room was silent. Catherine's head snapped toward the witness, her expression a mixture of disbelief and alarm. Klein's stammered response was all David needed. The jury caught it too. The trap was set, and the witness had walked right into it. During the recess, David stepped into the dimly lit hallway outside the courtroom. The air felt cooler here, quieter, until a low voice cut through the stillness. "You need to stop pushing, Harlow." He turned to see a tall man in a dark overcoat, his face partially obscured by shadow. "You're digging into things that could get you hurt." David studied him, recognizing him as one of Catherine's longtime associates. "Is that a threat?" David asked, his tone low. The man didn't answer. He just slipped a folded note into David's pocket and walked away. David's heart pounded as he opened it. Inside were 4 words: "You don't know everything." A chill ran down his spine. He realized then that this trial wasn't just about winning. It was about surviving. When court resumed, Catherine Harris came out swinging. Her voice was sharper, her pacing deliberate, every question designed to undermine David's case. She produced a surprise witness, someone from David's own past. "Mr. Harlow," she began, "is it true that 5 years ago you were disciplined by the bar for procedural misconduct?" The words hit like a punch. David's jaw tightened, but he kept his composure. "Yes," he said evenly, "and I also proved my innocence in that matter." Catherine smiled faintly, turning to the jury as though planting seeds of doubt about his credibility. David could feel the tide threatening to turn again. He knew this was her strategy, make the jury question him, not just the facts. And if he didn't act fast, it might work. That evening, long after the courthouse emptied, David sat alone in his office. Papers lay scattered across his desk, the dim desk lamp casting a warm but lonely glow over the mess. Catherine's counterattack had rattled him, but it hadn't broken him. He thought of Emily's testimony, of Daniel's courage, and of the faces of the jurors, who now held his client's fate in their hands. He knew he had one final chance to turn the narrative, to strike back with a closing argument that would leave no doubt. Outside, rain tapped softly against the window. The city lights blurred through the glass. Dave leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment, breathing deeply. Tomorrow would be the day. And he would walk into that courtroom ready to finish what he started. David didn't expect the envelope to arrive at his office that morning. "I think once you would later you today would help us to spread Nebul." No return address, no markings, just his name typed in bold black letters. Inside, he found photographs and documents that confirmed everything he'd been fighting to prove. Catherine Harris had tampered with key evidence. The images were grainy but undeniable, showing her with the victim days before the crime, in a place she claimed never to have been. His pulse quickened as he realized this was the weapon he needed. But the question was, who sent it? This kind of information came at a cost, and he knew favors like this didn't come for free. Still, there was no time to question motives. The trial was in motion, and this could be his chance to end Catherine's game once and for all. He tucked the documents into his case file, his jaw set with determination. One way or another, these would see the light of day. When David entered the courtroom that morning, he carried the envelope like a loaded weapon. The air was thick with anticipation. The jurors seated, the judge ready. Catherine sat across from him, calm on the surface, but with an alert sharpness in her eyes. David waited for the right moment. As the witness concluded, he rose from his seat. "Your Honor," he began, his voice steady, "I have newly obtained evidence that directly contradicts the prosecution's claims." The judge frowned, leaning forward. Catherine shifted in her seat, her smile faltering. David approached the bench, offering the photographs. The images were projected for the jury, and the room fell into stunned silence. Whispers rippled through the gallery. Catherine's gaze darkened. She knew exactly what this meant. This wasn't just a blow. It was a direct hit to the core of her case. Catherine wasted no time. As soon as the photographs were entered into the record, she stood. "Your Honor," she said crisply, "these so-called pieces of evidence are unverifiable and likely fabricated." Her voice cut through the room like a blade. David didn't flinch. "The metadata has been verified," he countered, "and I have a forensic analyst ready to testify." The tension between them was palpable, like two predators circling. Catherine's eyes narrowed, but her mind was already working to twist the narrative. She began questioning the chain of custody, the source of the evidence, anything that could plant doubt in the jury's mind. David realized she was willing to burn the entire case down before she admitted defeat. It was a dangerous game, but he was ready to play it. The judge called for a recess, and the courtroom emptied into the marble-floored hallway. David leaned against a column, reviewing his notes, when he felt a presence beside him. It was Emily. "You're rattling her," she whispered. "But she's dangerous when cornered." David gave a small nod. He already knew Catherine wouldn't go down without a fight, and that meant things were about to get unpredictable. "Stay close to Daniel," he told her quietly. "I don't trust what she might try next." Emily's eyes flicked nervously toward the courtroom doors. The tension hung heavy between them, the hallway buzzing with hushed voices and hurried footsteps. David glanced at his watch. Time was running out. Back in session, David called his forensic analyst to the stand. The man, calm and precise, walked the jury through the process of authenticating the photographs. Each step was clear, each word deliberate. The jurors leaned in, their attention fixed. Catherine attempted to object, but the judge overruled her. The analyst concluded, "These images are genuine and untampered with." The weight of those words landed heavily in the room. Catherine's expression hardened. She had lost control of the narrative. David knew the momentum had shifted. The trial wasn't over, but for the first time he could see the path to victory. It was narrow, and it was dangerous, but it was there. He straightened his shoulders, ready to finish what he had started. The morning session began with a quiet tension. David could see it in the way the jurors carried themselves. Slower steps, more guarded glances. Catherine's team had clearly been working overtime to sway them back during the recess. David tightened his grip on his notes, refusing to let the momentum slip. "Members of the jury," he began, "you've been presented with a storm of accusations. But storms pass, and when they do, the truth remains." His voice was deliberate, each word chosen with precision. Catherine sat still, her eyes locked on him, but her pen tapped rapidly against her notebook. He knew the jurors were under siege, targeted by whispers and subtle manipulations outside the courtroom. This was the moment to pull them back to the facts. The next witness was called, and the atmosphere shifted. Daniel Moore entered, his shoulders squared but eyes scanning the room warily. David knew Daniel carried more than just testimony, he carried fear. As Daniel took the stand, David approached slowly. "Mr. Moore," he said, "have you been contacted by anyone regarding your testimony?" Daniel hesitated. "Yes," he finally replied. "I was warned to keep quiet." The gallery murmured, and Catherine shot upright. "Objection," she barked, but the judge overruled. David pressed on. "Can you tell the court who issued that warning?" Daniel swallowed hard before speaking a name that sent a ripple of shock through the room. David felt the air shift. The walls of Catherine's defense were crumbling. Catherine wasted no time launching into her cross-examination. Her questions came fast, sharp as blades. "Mr. Moore, isn't it true you have a personal vendetta against me?" she demanded. Daniel's hands gripped the stand, but his voice was steady. "My only interest is the truth." The exchange was a war of attrition, Catherine trying to discredit, Daniel refusing to break. David watched closely, ready to object at the first sign of overreach. The judge's gaze darted between them, keenly aware of the escalating hostility. Every word spoken now could tilt the balance in one direction or the other. David knew if Daniel held his ground, Catherine's assault would backfire spectacularly. During the lunch recess, David stepped outside for air. The autumn wind cut through the courthouse steps, carrying the distant hum of city traffic. He didn't hear the man approach until a voice murmured behind him, "Drop this, Harlow, or you'll regret it." David turned, catching only a glimpse of a retreating figure disappearing into a black sedan. His jaw clenched. The threats were becoming more direct. He pulled out his phone, debating whether to alert the judge or keep it to himself. He knew Catherine's network ran deep, but this was the first time the danger had felt so personal. If they were trying to scare him off, they had underestimated just how far he was willing to go. That afternoon, the courtroom was unusually silent as proceedings resumed. The jurors seemed heavy with the weight of what they'd heard. Catherine's tone had softened, almost restrained, a calculated move, David suspected, to make herself seem less predatory. David stood, ready for his final questioning of the day. His voice was calm, but every syllable carried force. "This case has always been about more than one crime," he told them. "It's about the integrity of this court." The words hung in the air. Even Catherine didn't interrupt. In that silence, David felt the tide turning once more. Tomorrow would bring closing arguments, but the battle for the jury's hearts had already begun. The final day of trial arrived, the air in the courtroom heavy with anticipation. David rose slowly, his notes clutched but barely needed. "This case," he began, "was never about just one man's guilt or innocence. It was about truth, buried under power and fear." His eyes moved deliberately across the jury, making sure each person felt the weight of his words. Catherine sat motionless, her pen idle for the first time. David spoke of courage, of witnesses who risked their safety, of lies crafted to destroy. Every sentence was a deliberate strike at the fortress Catherine had built. The silence after he finished was deafening. When it was her turn, Catherine rose with a calm she didn't truly possess. Her voice was steady, but her eyes betrayed the cracks in her armor. She spoke of duty, of the victim's right to justice, and of the supposed manipulations of the defense. She paced slowly, occasionally meeting the jury's gaze with calculated intensity. But her arguments, once razor-sharp, now felt blunted against the wall of evidence David had built. When she sat down, she kept her eyes forward, refusing to look at David, an unspoken admission that she knew the ground beneath her had shifted. The jury filed back in, their faces unreadable. David's heart pounded, but his expression remained still. The foreperson rose. "We find the defendant not guilty." A wave of emotion swept through the room, gasps, murmurs, a few quiet sobs from the gallery. David's client clasped his arm, tears in his eyes. Catherine remained perfectly still, her lips pressed tight. For David it was victory, but it was not triumph, it was survival. The verdict didn't erase the threats, the sleepless nights, or the knowledge that powerful enemies still lingered. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed in a storm of light. Reporters shouted questions, their microphones reaching like spears. David shielded his client, guiding him toward a waiting car. Emily and Daniel stood nearby, silent but visibly relieved. Across the steps, Catherine exited through a side door, her expression hidden behind dark sunglasses. The city carried on around them, oblivious to the war that had just ended inside those walls. David knew this wasn't the end of the story, it never was. But for now, the case was over. That night, David sat alone in his office, the city skyline glowing through the window. The verdict had brought relief, but not peace. He replayed Catherine's parting glance in his mind, a silent promise that their paths would cross again. On his desk lay the photographs that had turned the trial, now sealed in an envelope. He poured a glass of whiskey, staring at the amber liquid before taking a slow sip. The phone rang once, twice, then stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than any gavel strike.